By 2019, the competition between Nvidia and AMD at the high end of the GPU market had become somewhat one-sided, and yet, as we saw last week, Team Red wasn't above putting on the puppy dog eyes and saying, "Come on, I'm just a little guy, it's my birthday," before cracking their opponent over the head with a rock. I forget where I was going with this metaphor. Anyway, with the performance crown firmly in hand, and value being kind of on their side for once, the last thing Nvidia needed this generation was to get greedy. I had a difficult decision to make for this video. For reasons known only to them, in February 2019, AMD decided to release the Radeon VII as a grand farewell to the GCN architecture before the switch to Navi, which would happen in July. The RX 5700 XT wasn't a flagship in the traditional sense. If the model number was anything to go by, and it was, the 700 models would be considered mid-range, with lower TGPs, less VRAM and less performance for a lower price. However, no 5800 or 5900 cards would ever arrive, so the 5700 XT would prove to be the highest end option of the first generation of RDNA-based GPUs. While the performance difference between the ultimate GCN card and the more humble first-gen RDNA model sometimes went in favour of the older architecture, at least early on, the stumbling block for the 7 was availability. In many markets around the world, it was effectively vaporware, an announcement for a product that would never show up. When choosing a candidate to face off against the RTX 2080 Ti for the best GPU available in 2019, that meant I had to pick between the initially higher performing, more expensive paper launch, or the far cheaper, more common card. The 7 was priced to compete with the already 2-year-old GTX 1080 Ti, and, as I found a while back, it didn't perform like it. So, factor in that neither card competed with the previous Nvidia flagship in terms of performance, but one was quite attractively priced, and I think I had my answer. There was no way that AMD's best in 2019 was going to directly compete with Nvidia's in raw performance, but in terms of value, it was possible that the RX 5700 XT was in with a shot. Nvidia's mighty RTX flagship had already been on the market for almost a year when the RX 5700 XT showed up, and while it was undoubtedly the wave of the future, a demonstration of Nvidia's godly ability to snap their fingers and create 2 whole new metrics to judge GPUs by, it wasn't making them any friends in the media. Most people, especially on YouTube, were incensed by the $1,000 retail price for this non-Titan series GPU, and even almost a year into its lifespan, ray tracing and DLSS hadn't yet achieved the kind of market saturation that was needed to make RTX cards a must-have. Time would be on the 2080 Ti's side, of course. Ray tracing is now far more common and more optimized, and DLSS promises to help this generation of GeForces become one of the most enduring. We didn't realize this at the time, of course, and asking anyone to pay $1,000 am I saying that right? Asking anyone to pay 1,000 smackaroos to invest in a graphics card whose main selling points involved running games at low resolutions was a marketing person's nightmare. Still, RTX features aside, the GeForce team weren't napping when it came to developing the Turing series GPUs, and the RTX 2080 Ti wasn't without its benefits over its legendary predecessor. Although the lack of improvement in VRAM was a colossal disappointment, especially given the importance of memory to gaming in the 2020s, it is at least GDDR6 rather than the 5x of its predecessor, achieving more than 25% more bandwidth on the same 352-bit bus. The GPU has seen a process shrink from 16 to 12 nanometers, and the significantly larger GPU die accommodates over 20% more CUDA cores, as well as all the extra hardware needed for RT and DLSS. Both cards being tested today are Gigabyte WindForces with almost identical external appearances. As usual, the games being tested are from the year of release, though in this case it's the year the 5700 XT released rather than the earlier 2080 Ti, as well as the year their predecessor was launched and the year they were superseded. Actually, that's another confusing point. The 5700 XT was replaced at the top of the AMD tree by the RX 6900 XT in 2020, whereas the RTX 3080 Ti replaced the 2080 Ti in 2021. I picked the later year for this comparison, mainly because I prefer to put a couple of years between game releases. By 2017, Nvidia already dominated the high-end, and the GTX 1080 Ti was the only non-Titan that could guarantee a solid experience at high resolutions in Assassin's Creed Origins. It wasn't perfect, however, and only managed 55 FPS at 4K high. The RTX flagship would close the gap, and then some. The average at 1080p of 117 FPS isn't that impressive compared to the previous gen card, which scored about 10% less than that. The RX 5700 XT, meanwhile, suffers a bit of a shocker. It actually performs dramatically worse than the Vega 64 did last week. At 1440p, the gap opens up a little, with the 2080 Ti's 98 FPS average now about 15% above the 1080 Ti and almost double the Radeon card's 53 FPS. At 4K, the RTX card is about 8 frames faster than the GTX, putting it above the 60 FPS line. The RDNA GPU is way behind at 36 FPS, but not exactly unplayable. Middle-earth Shadow of War kinda surprised me last week by being as demanding on the GPUs of its day as AC Origins was, sometimes more so. This time, both Turing and RDNA proved more than capable of handling it, with the RTX card in particular seeing a big boost in performance. At 1080p, the 2080 Ti can move 144 frames per second, while the 5700 XT hits 106. About 25% and 19% improvements over their respective predecessors. The margin grows slightly on the Nvidia side as we step up to 1440p, while the Radeons shrink by a few points, but both are still very playable. At 4K, the 2080 Ti hits a very smooth 62 FPS, a good 9 frames or so above its predecessor, while the 5700 XT falls to 40 FPS. Just a frame or two ahead of the Vega 64. Total War Warhammer 2 Hammer 2, sorry there's an echo in here, glides along at 1080p on both GPUs, with the 2080 Ti capable of 175 FPS, where the 5700 XT still manages almost 120. Increasing to 1440p, the Nvidia card is still pushing more frames than the AMD was at 1080p, while the Radeon falls to a still respectable 76 FPS. At 4K, the RTX is still above 60, and while strategy games aren't all that phased by low frame rates, psychologically the 37 FPS of the RDNA card feels low. Arcane's Prey is one of the less demanding games of its era, and so neither card is particularly troubled. In fact, as their predecessors weren't troubled by this one much either, there's not a lot here to make the 2080 Ti or 5700 XT look attractive. The 2080 Ti manages 240 FPS at 1080p, only about 10% above the 1080 Ti. The 5700 XT hits 220, about 15% above the Vega 64. At 1440, the RTX card hits 215, and the RDNA card hits 140, or 20 and 15% improved respectively. 4K is something the old Vega card wasn't quite capable of, falling away below the 60 mark, while the RX 5700 XT reaches almost 66. The 2080 Ti, meanwhile, is still over 100. Another lighter weight title from the end of the GTX era is For Honor, a medieval third-person parry-em-up designed for multiplayer co-op and PvP, and once more neither card finds themselves incapable of at least 60 FPS at any resolution. At 1080p things look pretty stellar for both cards, with the RTX 2080 Ti hitting 250 FPS and the RX 5700 XT still up there at almost 190. At 1440p, the GeForce drops to 175 and the Radeon to 120, but the jump to 4K chops both cards in half at the waist. The 2080 Ti's average falls by 48% to just 90 FPS, while the 5700 XT falls to 60 FPS with lows under 50. The launch year for the RTX 2080 Ti and RX 5700 XT, 2019 saw the release of that rarest of things, a PC port of a Rockstar game. Red Dead Redemption 2 is an already gorgeous game, and full of advanced settings and sliders to help make this version look even more spectacular, but for this test I'm sticking to all high settings, which, in true Rockstar fashion, isn't all that high. The RTX 2080 Ti disappoints me a little as it can't maintain 60+ at all resolutions. The RX 5700 XT disappoints me because it has remarkably poor frame pacing, possibly due to the era-appropriate drivers. At 1080p, the GeForce breaks past 100 FPS, while the Radeon manages a very respectable 94, though the aforementioned 1% lows aren't great. Stepping up to 1440p, both cards still have playable averages, but the stutter in the Radeon is getting worse. At 4K, the RTX card is sub 60, as I said, but it's still arguably looking pretty playable. The RX only hits 40 FPS, and the lows are only just about 20 FPS. Remedy's Control is not only extremely demanding in general, but it was also an early headline title for hardware ray tracing, and in a few weeks' time I'll be looking at how the first-gen RTX flagship performed in those early titles compared to today's RT games. In the meantime, the 2080 Ti dominates in rasterized rendering. At 1080p it's over 100 FPS practically all the time, averaging 130. The Radeon loses out dramatically, only managing 87.5 FPS, perhaps in line with expectations considering the price difference, but still a bigger margin than we've come to expect. At 1440p, the GeForce equals the Radeon's score at 1080p, while the Radeon sadly can't keep up 60+ without dropping settings. At 4K, neither card performs particularly well, with the 2080 Ti losing half its performance and the 5700 XT losing almost 60%. As I mentioned last week, Resident Evil 2's prioritised graphics preset defaults to including FSR Ultra Quality, and I forgot to turn it off. We're talking about the most powerful GPUs of 2019. This kind of performance really isn't necessary in a third-person horror game. Still, it's a pretty robust engine, and the CPU did not limit either GPU at all. At 1080p, the 2080 Ti is approaching 290 FPS, with lows close to 200. The 5700 XT is an equally impressive 246 FPS on average, just 15% below the GeForce. Both remain extremely playable when pushed up to 1440p, averaging 196 and 165 respectively. Even at 4K, though admittedly with FSR still enabled, both cards remain over 60 and the GeForce is still above 100 FPS. Another RT flagship title, and another game that's really pretty demanding even without it. Metro Exodus performance looks pretty solid at a 120 FPS average on the Turing card at 1080p, and the RDNA GPU reaches 81. However, the lows are about half the average in both cases, due to just how demanding the outdoor section of the benchmark is. At 1440, the 2080 Ti drops to 93, and the 5700 XT holds a little above 60. At 4K, GeForce owners might want to kick in some DLSS, as the 2080 Ti drops a little under the 60 mark. At a mere 36 FPS without upscaling, with lows of 22, I don't think the Radeon can be rescued without some serious hits to image quality. Borderlands 3 starts off well on the cards of the day, but it doesn't scale up well to higher resolutions. Both cards are smooth as butter at 1080p, with the RTX card averaging over 130 FPS and the RX over 110. At 1440p, the Radeon falls to 75, which isn't the end of the world, and I'm sure plenty of gamers at the time would have taken it. At 4K, neither card does very well, and this is particularly disappointing for the GeForce. It's a year old by the time this game came out, sure, but 48 FPS on a $1,000 graphics card this soon after launch is pretty bad, and the game does not look good enough to warrant this level of performance. Still, this isn't the worst thing to happen to Borderlands lately. The RX 5700 XT was replaced as the most powerful GPU in the Radeon lineup by the RX 6900 XT in December of 2020. But that year seemed a bit too close to 2019 to count as next gen. Plus, the 2080 Ti wasn't replaced until 2021, so this seemed like a better candidate for a next-gen year. Guardians of the Galaxy has a built-in benchmark, which I recall being extremely misleading, as the first level of the game is dramatically more demanding. However, I just need numbers, so it's gonna have to do. At 1080p, both cards hold up remarkably well, but it's definitely Nvidia's game to win, with the 2080 Ti coming close to 200 FPS and the RX 5700 XT at about half that. At 1440p, the GeForce only drops to 142 FPS, while the Radeon isn't a high refresh experience anymore and can only manage a smooth but pedestrian 75. At 4K, the 2080 Ti is still playable without relying on upscaling, averaging 77, but the 5700 XT falls off to just 44 FPS. RE Village is on the same engine as the RE Remake games, but has an even more annoying menu. Seriously, since when was it okay to make delete the button to quit the game? Fortunately, this time it doesn't default to adding upscaling at the graphics priority preset, but both cards glide along in this one. If you've started PC gaming since 2023, you might not realise that there was a time just a couple of years ago when brand new games ran on mid-range hardware at this kind of frame rates. The Radeon acquits itself admirably at 1080p, with its 190 FPS coming relatively close to the GeForce's 240. At 1440 things are still looking great, with the Turing card falling to 165 and the RDNA to 125. In fact, while both cards take a huge hit at 4K, they have enough overhead that both are still remarkably playable, averaging almost 90 for the 2080 Ti and over 60 for the 5700 XT. Halo Infinite seemed like a weird outlier at the time, a game from the next generation of consoles that performed way worse on older generation hardware, and whose visuals, while perfectly fine in my opinion, didn't seem to justify the heavy performance penalty. At 1080p it seems like both these cards are doing pretty well, though despite being designed for the all AMD Xbox Series consoles, it does a fair bit better on GeForce. The 2080 Ti can pull about 120 FPS, while the 5700 XT only manages 73. At 1440p the GeForces are still very smooth 94 FPS, while the Radeon dips below 60. At 4K the 2080 Ti is still barely above the 60 mark, but everything else is going just fine. The 5700 XT falls to a much less enjoyable 40 FPS, and one of the game's hallmarks start to appear. When it's running out of resources, the level of detail drops horribly, causing trees and even the landscape to drop to its lowest LOD. Things take an interesting turn in Forza Horizon 5. This open-world, semi-simcade racer is another Xbox port, and this time one that definitely favours AMD hardware. And I knew this in advance, but I didn't realise it was to this extent. Either the RX 5700 XT is a bargain for Forza fans, or the 2080 Ti is a steaming great rip-off. At 1080p high settings, the two cards are within margin of error of each other. It's not a CPU or engine limitation, naturally. If you've seen Forza Horizon 5 benchmarks before, you know how well optimized it is, and the RX 7900 XT can turn in about 280 FPS at these settings. I'm thinking it might have something to do with Nvidia driver overhead, as by 1440p the gap opens up a little and the 2080 Ti takes more of a lead. Still not enough in my opinion, but at least it makes more sense, and both GPUs remain over 100 FPS. At 4K, both cards are above 60, but the 5700 XT's mid-range market position will prove a problem, as I've seen 8GB cards run out of VRAM at higher resolutions before, and it wouldn't surprise me if that error message reared its ugly head in this case. Finally, Deathloop returns to business as usual. It's from Arcane, the people behind games like Prey and Dishonored, titles known more for their stylized art over photorealism. This means some fairly high frame rates, even on the 5700 XT, but there are no surprises here. The 2080 Ti is about as fast at 1440 as the 5700 XT is at 1080p, but both games remain eminently playable. However, one of the plagues of modern gaming shows itself once again. The 8GB Radeon gets a memory warning at 1440p, and while it didn't seem to have any major adverse effects during my testing, I can only assume it'll be a problem eventually. At 4K, the 5700 XT drops to the low 30s, though this is probably just because the RDNA 1 GPU isn't up to the challenge, as there were none of the major stutters or graphical problems that I'd normally associate with running out of memory. You won't be surprised to hear me say that the 2080 Ti walks away with the performance crown in this one. You know as well as I do that although these were the best GPUs from their respective brands at the time, they're not in the same league. The entertainment comes from seeing how close they could occasionally get, and venturing into the next gen, there are one or two occasions where the 5700 XT doesn't make it easy for the 2080 Ti. When I compared the 1080 Ti to the Vega 64 in cost per frame last week, the weaker but cheaper AMD won 6 out of 9 matchups. And I said this small victory wasn't enough to justify the higher TGP and lower VRAM. This week, the RX 5700 XT wins 9 out of 9. The GeForce is obliterated at every resolution tested and in every year. Yes, the 2080 Ti is faster at 4K, and the 5700 XT is overall below 60 FPS at that resolution, but at 1080p and 1440p, the 5700 XT can achieve smooth, playable frame rates in almost every game. Meanwhile, the RTX 2080 Ti has a ray tracing feature that wasn't powerful enough to even turn on in most games, at least not without also enabling upscaling and dropping the render resolution to somewhere below 1080p. Neither of these cards is in the running for the title of GOAT. The 5700 XT lacks performance in some key metrics, Radeon cards were still less efficient than GeForce's in 2019, and RDNA 1 just didn't have the impact that RDNA 2 would have just a year later. However, the RTX 2080 Ti's obscene price was justified by party tricks no one was interested in at the time. In another context, selling on the used market for under $300 in 2024, at a time where 11GB of VRAM, DLSS and RT are all far more appreciated, it's actually a pretty good card. 5 years ago, as a $1,000 flagship, it was a travesty. If I have to pick between the two, I'd say the winner is the RX 5700 XT. However, the question is, which is the best card on the market in 2019? And I think the answer to that is the GTX 1080 Ti. I'm on holiday next week, so there's a chance the next part of the GOAT project will be delayed until the following week, depending on how busy I am packing my suitcase. Either way, the next video in the series will compare the RTX 3080 Ti to the RX 6900 XT. It's closer than you might think. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.